The café on Broadway hummed with the rush of morning. Jackets brushed against each other, briefcases knocked, voices rose and fell in fragments of urgency. Steam curled upward from the espresso machine, mingling with the scent of roasted beans and damp coats. Nora Bennett balanced her phone between shoulder and ear, folders clutched to her chest. She murmured into the line, barely glancing up when the barista asked for her order. Cappuccino. To go. The card machine beeped. Declined. Her breath caught. She shifted the folders, tried again, hand trembling just slightly. Beep. Declined. Cough behind her. The line shifted, restless. Someone muttered about being late. Nora's throat tightened, but her expression stayed perfectly composed, the way it always did. And then, it's just coffee. Happens to everyone. A man in a faded security jacket stepped forward. He didn't wait for her to protest. One quick tap of his card, the machine beeped again, approved, and the barista slid the cup across the counter. The man stepped back as if nothing had happened. No lingering look, no expectation. Just a quiet gesture in the crowded hum of morning. The cappuccino was warm in her hand, though Nora barely tasted it. She stepped aside, letting the next customer take her place at the counter. A whisper of froth touched her lip, and in her distraction she tilted the cup too far. A pale streak of coffee bled onto the cuff of her sleeve, blooming like an unwelcome bruise against the cream fabric. She hissed under her breath, searching blindly for a napkin. Nothing within reach but crumpled receipts, her folders slipping as she tried to juggle them. The barista was already shouting another order. People brushed past, impatient. Then, without a word, something was set down on the counter beside her hand. A folded square of white cotton. An actual handkerchief, clean, pressed, absurdly out of place among paper cups and plastic lids. She glanced sideways. It was him, the man in the worn security jacket, the one who had paid for her coffee like it was nothing at all. He didn't look at her now. His gaze was fixed on the floor tiles, shoulders slightly stooped, as if offering this small thing cost him nothing and yet everything. Nora hesitated. A thank you rose to her lips, but the weight of the moment strangled it. She pressed the handkerchief to her sleeve, dabbing carefully, feeling the softness of the fabric against her skin. Not hotel laundered, not perfumed, just simple, cared for, something kept for use, not for show. When she finally looked up, he was already turning away, cup in hand, moving back into the crowd that swallowed him without notice. No lingering glance, no smile, no line left open for her to follow. She stood frozen longer than she meant to. Around her the café pulsed forward, baristas calling names, a child whining for a muffin, a businessman arguing into his headset. Yet the space felt strangely hollow, as if the quietness of that gesture had pressed itself into her chest. It unsettled her. She was not easily unsettled. Nora Bennett, whose calendar was carved into 15-minute increments, who faced down boardrooms without blinking, who rarely, if ever, spilled coffee on herself. But the simple act of a stranger handing her a handkerchief without expectation, without even looking at her, gnawed at her calm like a splinter under skin. She folded the fabric carefully, as though returning it, but when she glanced around he was gone. The line had moved on. The door swung shut with a rush of cold air, and only then did she realize her fingers were still curled around the square of white. Nora tucked it into her folder, absurdly cautious, as though it might disintegrate if treated carelessly. She carried it with her through the revolving doors back into the wind of Broadway, the city's noise crashing back over her. Yet for the rest of the walk, through the blur of traffic lights and crossing signals, she felt the faintest trace of warmth. Not from the coffee, not from the coat she wore, but from the memory of someone who had been kind when no one was watching. Hours later, the Broadway café was just a memory. Nora Bennett now sat in her office, 30 floors above the restless city. The windows of Bennett Innovations stretched from floor to ceiling, the skyline painted in pale afternoon light. Cars below moved like streams of silver ants, too small to matter. Her desk was clean, precise. Pens aligned, folders stacked, laptop open to a spreadsheet of names. The recruitment process for the expansion project had been grueling. Dozens of applications, cover letters, resumes, all blurred into one another until she barely saw faces anymore. Just words on paper, bullet points, degrees, gaps. She sipped her second coffee of the day, stronger, bitter, and clicked through another file. Marketing lead, rejected. Junior analyst, rejected. A promising candidate with a glowing resume moved forward. Then another file slid into her view, already marked in red by HR. Declined. Something made her pause. Perhaps it was the name. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Evan Carter. Nora's brow furrowed. The letters arranged themselves strangely in her mind. She clicked open the resume. 8 years at a respected engineering firm. Senior position. Not just competent, exceptional. Leading teams, reducing costs, designing systems that others had failed to master. His references spoke of precision, reliability, loyalty. And then a gap. 3 years unaccounted for. No positions listed. No consulting work, no part-time roles, nothing. A silence that stretched across the page like a shadow. Her eyes scanned to the HR notes at the bottom. Employment break. Incomplete file. Candidate unsuitable. The file had been moved to the rejection pile, dismissed without a second glance. Nora leaned back in her chair. The cappuccino incident from the morning flickered across her memory. The worn security jacket, the quiet voice, the handkerchief. She shook her head. Coincidence, surely. The city was full of Carters. And yet, curiosity tugged at her, insistent. She keyed into the internal search system, pulling public records, old press mentions. Slowly, the pieces began to form. There had been an accident. 3 years ago, a highway collision. His wife and daughter, gone in a single night. The silence on the resume was not laziness, not carelessness. It was grief. It was the kind of wound that stopped clocks and bent entire lives out of shape. Nora's chest tightened. She stared at the screen, at the clipped, efficient summary of a man's life reduced to bullet points. The HR note, incomplete, burned in her vision. Incomplete. As if a human being could ever be reduced to the neatness of a file. Her phone buzzed. Another meeting reminder. She ignored it, eyes still locked on the name. Evan Carter. The man who had handed her coffee, offered a handkerchief, vanished into the crowd. And here he was again, not as a stranger, but as someone her company had dismissed without a second thought. Nora closed the file slowly. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass of her office window. Her pulse was unsteady, her thoughts louder than the hum of the city. The coincidence pressed against her ribs like a secret, and with it came a decision she hadn't expected to face. To let the file slip back into the pile of the forgotten, or to pull it back into the light. She reached for the intercom. The conference room was smaller than the boardroom, but its glass walls still looked out across Manhattan, the skyline washed in late afternoon haze. Evan Carter sat opposite her, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly on the table. The faded jacket was gone. He wore a simple shirt, freshly pressed, though the cuffs showed wear. Nora studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You know you're overqualified for this role?" His gaze was steady. "Yes, but I'm not asking for pity. I'm looking for purpose." Something in his voice disarmed her, low, even, but with a weight beneath it. Not rehearsed, not defensive. Just true. She tapped the folder before her. "Your record is strong. But the gap, 3 years. I stepped away," he said simply. No excuses, no embellishment. Just the blunt edge of honesty. Silence pressed between them, filled with the muted hum of the city. Nora leaned back in her chair, weighing what HR would call a mistake. But HR hadn't seen the man who bought coffee for a stranger without expectation, or left a handkerchief without a word. "Here's what I'll do," she said finally. "A trial role. Short term. You'll assist on the new project team. Show me what you can do, and we'll talk again." His jaw tightened slightly, but his nod was measured, respectful. "Fair enough." Nora closed the folder and slid it aside. The interview was over, yet neither of them moved. For a moment, the glass walls seemed to seal them into a space outside the company, outside the rules. Just two people who, by chance, had crossed paths twice, and now were bound to cross them again. Word spread quickly, as it always did in offices built on glass and whispers. The new face in the project team was not a hire from an Ivy League pool, nor a headhunter's prized candidate. He was the man people had seen in the lobby, scanning badges, holding doors, the security guard. The glances came first, then the half-smiles, then the murmurs behind coffee cups. The security guy, on the project team. Nora felt the weight of their questions during the first week. She ignored them, but she noticed the shift in atmosphere whenever Evan entered a room. He carried himself quietly, never defensive, never boastful. Yet silence has a way of amplifying suspicion. At his first review session, the team gathered around the long oak table, their laptops casting faint light against pale faces. Numbers scrolled across the projection screen, supply chain figures, quarterly cost reports. People spoke quickly, stacking jargon on jargon, until the words blurred into noise. Evan sat at the far end, pen unmoving, eyes steady. When the room finally quieted, Nora turned toward him. "You've had time to look at the data. Thoughts?" He cleared his throat, voice even. "You're losing $500,000 a year in redundancies. 3 systems doing the same job, overlapping reports no one reads. If you cut them, you could reduce costs by 80%. Silence. The kind that isn't just quiet but weighted, pressing down on every person present. A few blinked at him, others leaned forward as if mishearing. One analyst spoke at last, skeptical. $500,000? That's an exaggeration. Evan slid a folder across the table. Printouts, highlighted columns, footnotes. Not an exaggeration. Conservative. I mapped the inefficiencies here. They bent over the papers. Frowns, then nods, then the rustle of agreement too reluctant to admit itself. Questions followed, sharp at first, then softer, until finally the skepticism cracked into curiosity. By the end of the session, voices that had once whispered doubts were asking him how he'd found what they'd missed. He answered simply, without arrogance. I looked where no one wanted to. Nora sat at the head of the table, watching not just the shift in numbers but the shift in faces. Respect, reluctant at first, then genuine, edged into the air. When the meeting ended, she closed her laptop with deliberate calm. "Mr. Carter," she said, meeting his eyes, "I think we'll extend your trial. Effective immediately, you'll move into a permanent consultant role." He gave the faintest nod, no smile, no flourish. Yet in his stillness, there was a gravity that silenced any further doubts. Later, when the team filed out, Nora lingered by the window, looking at the city lights flickering awake. Somewhere between suspicion and revelation, something had shifted, not just for the company, but for her. News traveled fast in a company like Bennett Innovations. Faster than emails, faster than official memos. It spread in raised eyebrows near the elevators, in muffled laughter by the espresso machine, in the half-sentences that trailed off when doors opened. The new addition to the project team wasn't from Harvard Business School or poached from a rival firm. He hadn't been recommended by a headhunter with glossy charts. He was the man people had seen in the lobby, scanning badges, occasionally holding umbrellas for late employees when rain caught them by surprise. The security guard. First it was disbelief. Then came amusement, whispers curling like smoke in corners of meeting rooms. The security guy, on the project team, Evan seemed immune to it. He walked into rooms without haste, sat at the edge of tables, kept his notes in a plain folder. He didn't try to fill the silence, didn't push himself forward. But his quietness didn't go unnoticed. In offices like these, silence always drew more attention than words. Nora felt the undercurrent. She caught the way conversations paused when Evan entered, the sideways glances when his name appeared on email threads. She ignored it, but it sat on her shoulders like invisible weight. The first review session arrived on a gray Thursday morning. The project team filled the long oak table, laptops open, screens casting a sterile glow. Numbers scrolled endlessly across the projector, supply chain figures, quarterly costs, procurement notes. Voices overlapped, acronyms flew like sharp arrows. Analysis piled on analysis, jargon feeding on itself until the meaning thinned into noise. Evan sat quietly at the far end, pen unmoving. His gaze didn't wander, but he didn't take notes like the others either. He simply listened. When the discussion finally thinned, Nora glanced toward him. "Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "you've had time to study the reports. Any observations?" The room shifted. A few suppressed smiles, expecting hesitation, maybe even fumbling. Instead, Evan's voice came steady. "You're losing $500,000 a year in redundancies," he said. 3 systems duplicating work. Reports generated monthly that no one reads. If you cut them, you'd reduce costs by about 80%. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of impact, the kind that lands heavy and presses everyone into stillness. Finally, one analyst laughed under his breath. $500,000? That's an exaggeration. Without changing expression, Evan slid a folder forward. Printed spreadsheets, highlighted columns, meticulous footnotes. "Not an exaggeration," he said. "If anything, this is conservative. The overlap begins here." He tapped a chart, and snowballs into wasted hours, vendor double charges, and misallocated budgets. One by one, they bent over the pages. First skepticism, then frowns, then the slow nods of people forced to admit what they hadn't wanted to see. Questions began. At first sharp, defensive. He answered each one with quiet precision, pointing to numbers, tracing patterns, never raising his voice. After 10 minutes, the sharpness had dulled into genuine curiosity. After 20, the room had shifted entirely. By the time the session closed, the same colleagues who had whispered doubts were now scribbling notes from his analysis, asking him how he'd spotted what everyone else had missed. Evan's reply was simple, almost plain. I looked where no one wanted to look. Nora sat at the head of the table, watching not just the shift in the numbers but the shift in posture. Respect, reluctant at first, then unmistakable, had settled into the room. She let the silence linger before closing her laptop with deliberate calm. Mr. Carter, she said, her gaze steady on him. Your trial role is extended. Effective immediately, you'll move into a permanent consultant position. A ripple went through the room. Evan only nodded, no smile, no flourish. But the stillness around him carried weight, as if something unspoken had finally been acknowledged. When the team dispersed, voices buzzing about cost savings and revised strategies, Nora stayed seated by the window. The city stretched out below, restless, glittering. She thought of the cappuccino, the handkerchief folded on the counter, the resume marked incomplete. Now, as the office lights flickered on against the dusk, she realized something had shifted, not just for the company, but for her. It began with an email. A single line flagged red in Nora's inbox just after midnight. Confidential files accessed. Possible leak. By morning, the building buzzed with panic. Investors called, board members demanded explanations, and every whisper seemed to carry her name. Bennett Innovations compromised. Bennett Innovations exposed. Nora stood in the boardroom as the storm broke. The long mahogany table gleamed under cold light, but the faces around it were sharper than the gloss. Men in tailored suits, women with pens poised like weapons. Questions fired without pause. Why wasn't this caught? Who signed off on the security protocol? Nora, your team failed. The weight pressed against her ribs. She opened her mouth, ready to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. For weeks she had stayed past midnight, tracing lines of code, auditing systems. She knew the flaw wasn't neglect. It was hidden deep, nearly invisible. But explanations meant little when fear circled like blood in the water. She tightened her grip on the folder before her. Her silence stretched, and in that stretch came the verdict forming in their eyes. Blame. And then a chair scraped. Evan Carter rose from the far end of the table. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost quiet, but it cut through the din. With respect, he said, she's not the problem. I am. The room stilled. Heads turned. My system missed the flaw, he continued, steady as stone. I built the redundancy checks. If you want blame, place it on me. But while you've been looking for someone to accuse, she's been here every night, combing through data to fix it. A hush fell. The air changed, heavy with something unspoken. Nora's eyes flicked to him. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared, not in defense, but in truth. For the first time since the meeting began, the pressure in her chest loosened, just enough for breath to return. No one spoke immediately. The board members glanced at each other, pens frozen midair. Someone cleared his throat. Another shifted uncomfortably. The momentum of accusation had been broken, redirected, silenced. Evan sat down again as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room was different now. The sharp edges had dulled. Questions lost their bite. The storm receded into uneasy quiet. Nora lowered her gaze to the folder in her hands, the paper edges cutting faintly into her fingers. She didn't speak. Not yet. There was nothing to add. His words had carved out a space where she could breathe again. When the meeting finally adjourned, the board members filed out with clipped nods, their eyes avoiding hers, their fury replaced by something more cautious. She remained seated, the city skyline glowing faintly through the tall glass windows. Across the table, Evan gathered his notes with the same quiet precision as always. No glance toward her, no need for acknowledgement. But Nora knew. In a world where alliances were built on convenience, he had stood beside her when it cost something. He had defended her without gain, without performance. For the first time in years, she felt less alone at that long, gleaming table. Months later, the stage lights burned warm against Nora's face. Applause swelled through the hall, filling every corner, bouncing off glass and steel. The launch of Second Chance Hiring was official, a program designed to give overlooked candidates a fair shot. Inspired by one story, his story, she smiled for the cameras, spoke her words with practiced calm, but her eyes kept searching the crowd. Past investors, past journalists, past her own staff, until they found him. Evan stood near the back, hands folded, expression unreadable. No spotlight touched him, yet she felt his presence stronger than all the noise around her. After the speeches, after the handshakes, after the clinking of glasses, she slipped away from the crowd. The hallway was quieter, shadows stretching long beneath dim lights. He was there, waiting as though he'd known she would come. Her voice was softer than she intended. "I don't love you because you bought me coffee." He tilted his head, eyes steady. "I love you because you're kind when no one's watching." For a long moment, silence held between them, not empty, but full, like the pause before a note settles into music. Then Evan's mouth curved into the smallest smile. "Then let me buy the next one," he said. His hand brushed hers. Slow, deliberate. She let her fingers slip into his, the simplest of gestures, and yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken: grief, survival, second chances. Outside, the city roared on. But in that quiet hallway, they had found something rare. Not an ending, but the beginning of something that finally felt real.